Hello, everyone. This is your mini lecture to set you up for the discussion board assignment to substitute for our February 6th, 2014 class. I apologize for the sound of my voice, but hopefully we will get through this all right and you'll be set up for your activity. So, the two stories that we're going to focus on for the activity are two of the more contemporary short stories that you've read. All of these last few authors are 20th and in some cases 21st century authors that really bring us up to just about the present day with short fiction before we move on to poetry. And we were focusing again on the A.S. Byatt story, The Thing in the Forest, and the Gabriel Garcia Marquez story, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. And a thematic and generic approach I want us to look at with these two stories is something called magical realism. And you may have heard of this concept before, this kind of story before. If you've ever read Isabel Allende's novels, particularly one of her most famous is called The House of the Spirits, you've seen this in action. And rare for an academic term, magical realism means what it says on the tin. It's the juxtaposition of magic and realism, or reality and fantasy. That you have a recognizable world. A story's not going to be magical realism if it's set in Tolkien's Middle Earth, because that's a completely other universe, other rules. It's very clearly an alternate reality. Magical realism exists within our version of reality, but then impossible or fantastical elements are present. And I like to think of reality and fantasy as a kind of spectrum. You might have kind of the pure fantasy, like a Tolkien or like a magical fairy tale on the one side, and then you have very naturalistic, even gritty realism on the other side. And one of the things that distinguishes magical realism as a genre is that it's very matter of fact toward the fantastic, the unreal. You saw in Marquez's story that this angel appears and they go from nightmare to he's familiar and we have an explanation for him in about a paragraph. And often in magical realist writing, the magical elements are presented in a very matter of fact way. In Isabel Allende's House of the Spirits, for example, there is a character who is born with green hair, and it's mentioned and sort of never remarked on again. It becomes part of the fabric of the world. And this is most famously something that a lot of Latin American writers, like Garcia Marquez, like Allende, have done. And it's particularly considered a 20th century Latin American tradition. But certainly, I think there are other texts that we could describe in this way, and we could say that have participated in this tradition or have acted as variations of this tradition. Some leaning more toward the fantasy end of the spectrum, some leaning more toward the reality end. You look at something like even the Harry Potter series, where we spend most of our time in this magical world, but our world is present alongside it. And in these two stories, if you look at kind of these specifically magical elements that say this is not the reality that you thought you lived in. This does not comply with the rules. We have, of course, the angel, the man with enormous wings in the title. And then we have the Spider Woman, who is in that carnival in the latter half of Very Old Man with Enormous Wings. And then you have that Loathly Worm book that Penny and Primrose find when they go back to that country house as adults. And many of these elements, of course, also tie in with, excuse me, I jumped ahead there. Many of these things also tie in with real British history. That children were evacuated during World War II to get out of London during the Blitz, and country houses were given to the nation and changed into museums after the war. And see if for a moment, just brainstorm if you can think of maybe other magical elements, other fantastical elements that are in these stories. Or maybe just think of other things you've read. This is actually a fairly popular subgenre of TV today, where you have some of these magical or impossible creatures living alongside modern life. I think of that Grimm show, based on the Grimm fairy tales loosely, or the Sleepy Hollow show, things like that. And now this is the slide I accidentally skipped to a moment ago. Some of them, the style elements that you want to pay attention to for how Byatt and Marquez set this up. It's very matter-of-fact diction. If you look at the first paragraph of Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, until you get to impeded by his enormous wings, that very last phrase, you've got a normal day. You've got something that could absolutely happen that is completely unremarkable. And then I mentioned the term nightmare, but then they replace it with familiar. And toward the end of the story, when Elisenda is watching the angel fly out of her backyard, she says that, well, he's no longer an annoyance. And we get a hyper focus on the details. Look, for example, on page 307 in the main textbook at that 2-paragraph description we get of the horrible, grotesque appearance of the thing in the forest. And it goes on and on. And of course, this is so the author can give us a mental picture, but you'd think in reality in that situation you might run, right? Yet the perspective of the story is staying there, focusing on it, making us really see it. And the sources of reference and comparison, particularly for the descriptions of the thing in the forest, are very much worth a second look. If you just kind of run down the things he's described as literally or figuratively being made of. We have excrement, we have wounded flesh, we have rotting food, we have industrial waste, we have dirty dishcloths, we have bug larvae, just everything disgusting, everything wasted and decayed and no longer useful. And of course, all this adds up to World War II and social destruction. And particularly his mutated form really adds up to nuclear fears. And of course, the presence of nuclear war comes out of World War II and is part of the psychology of all that comes after. And then, of course, the angel and the Spider Woman in many ways remind us of traditional fairy tale images. And the Spider Woman gets transformed while she's walking through the woods alone at night. Classic fairy tale image. We also see in magical realism some interesting manipulations of time, that we jump from the 40s to the 80s because of the needs of the story in The Thing in the Forest. But the theme remains the same. And there is an uncertain relationship with reality. Yes, the bizarre and the fantastic are there, and they are presented in a matter-of-fact way, but sometimes we have to question ourselves, or our characters question themselves. You get that great moment when Penny and Primrose, as children, come out of the forest and expect everything to have been destroyed, but all the other children are playing as though nothing had happened. And then they have to question themselves, did I make it up, or is it only us who can see it, and what does that mean? And then, of course, when they've grown up and they see the documentation in the book in the museum and realize that whatever else it is, they didn't make it up, they have to incorporate that. And the use of balance, circularity, fluidity in the writing style. As you notice in Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, it is Pelayo, the husband, who first finds him as he has crashed to Earth, and then it is Elisenda, Pelayo's wife, who watches him fly away at the end of the story and regain his world. So there's a balance there. And then there is a circularity that we see in The Thing in the Forest. For one thing, it's a cycle of this creature that we get the sense that it has always been there, and so far as we know, will continue to be there, will continue to appear to people. It's not the kind of story we might see in a movie or something where they are the ones to finally defeat it. They simply have to grapple with its reality. And literally in the text, you notice the first sentence and the last sentence of the story are the same, and this is a device that actually Isabel Allende uses in House of the Spirits. The first sentence and the last sentence are the same. So there's not a linear quality to the narrative. There's not this very rational quality. We can set it aside. It's got a definite beginning, middle, and end. There is this more complex structure to it. Stephen King did the same thing with the Dark Tower series. The first sentence of the first book is the last sentence of the last book. So it's like a perfect circle, or it's like a snake eating its tail, or any number of other interesting metaphors in between. So I hope you enjoyed this little introduction to magical realism. It is a wonderful genre. As you've seen, particularly I think with A.S. Byatt, it can be a pretty serious genre. All of the historical events in that story were real things. You did have children evacuated during the Blitz. You did have a lot of members of that generation die in the war. You would have had the struggles afterward in your life, and all of that's represented. The changing economy of Britain with the country houses being donated, all that is being honored and grappled with. And a lot of the Latin American writers, particularly Isabel Allende and Julia Alvarez, will really grapple with some very difficult, very challenging politics, a lot of revolutions, a lot of very sad things. But it's a genre that allows us to confront all that in a particular way. It's a genre I enjoy reading for pleasure. And to do then your discussion board assignment to work in for the class discussion that we are not having on February 6th, it's going to be worth 2 quiz grades. You're going to do an initial post and a response. And if you go in to that discussion board area, or if you just go through the content button, if the embed code is working for you and you're watching this video right there embedded in Blackboard, of course you'll see it. It's the next link down, but you can get into it a couple ways, and then you just follow the instructions. And I look forward to seeing everyone back in class on Tuesday.